As I told you, today we will be discussing Sigmund Freud's understanding of religion. In order to make this easy for us, understandable, I will be talking this lecture in 4 parts. First, we will be dealing with the ontogenetic theory of religion according to Freud. So I shall type that word ontogenetic theory so that you can understand what I am going to explain. So ontogenetic theory of Freud is based on social anthropology. Secondly, I will discuss about this phylogenetic theory of religion. Again, I shall type that word for you, phylogenetic. Phylogenetic theory of religion. Theory of religion. Good. So you have both these words right there, ontogenetic theory and phylogenetic theory. I mean, that's for the sake of the spelling. Then we will have a critical appraisal of both these theories, and as usual, we will take up some of the questions that his understanding of religion raises to us so that we can discuss meaningfully some of the relevance of the questions that he raises for us today in our context. Sigmund Freud was born in 1856, so he was born in the end of 19th century but lived up to 1939, the early 20th century. I'm not going to give the detailed bibliography of Freud that you can find online. If you Google, his bibliography is available. Some of the important works that are directly related to his understanding of religion are Totem and Taboo, Moses and Monotheism, and Future of an Illusion. These are some of the important works. I shall put that down in the chat box so that you don't need to worry about it. These are some of the important works of Freud: Totem and Taboo, Moses and Monotheism, Future of an Illusion. So if you have time, you can read any of these works. If you need any copy of that work, that you can ask me, that I can send it to you. Let us now begin with the ontogenetic theory of religion according to Freud. Science has uncovered many laws to explain why the world functions as it does. Before the advent of science, people couldn't understand why the world functions the way it does today. Therefore, when there is a certain calamity, people would think that it is the punishment that is given to us by gods. So therefore, the gods have certain tasks to fulfill. So therefore, there is a whole understanding of need for gods to fulfill certain tasks remained in the life before the advent of science. What science did was to exorcise gods from our everyday common experience, from the common objects that we deal with. Even after the advent of science, still we are sometimes caught up between, on the one hand, the need for gods to fulfill certain tasks, but also in our attempt to exorcise gods from everyday objects. In spite of the development of science, we still make use of the idea of God to perform 3 tasks in our lives. The first task is to remove the terrors of nature. So we somehow spontaneously think God can remove the terrors of nature, and he has this task. All that you need to do is to supplicate God so that he can remove the terrors of nature. The second task that we attribute to God is He can somehow reconcile us to our death, to our fate in general and to our death in particular. The third task that we attribute to God is that somehow He can reconcile us for the pains involved in partaking the civilization. So civilization doesn't happen without pain, and God can reconcile us for these pains that we have to necessarily undergo. So this is the backdrop against which Freud is trying to develop his ontogenetic theory. Now let us try and understand what this ontogenetic theory means. By ontogenetic theory, Freud refers to the origin of religiosity in every individual. As an individual, not as a community, as a collective entity, but as an individual. How does I have the sense of religiosity in me as an individual? In other words, what makes me as an individual to adopt religious belief? Why as an individual I accept certain beliefs given to me by religion or beliefs that are related to religion? In order to address this question, Freud begins with a certain empirical assessment by observing what is happening around us. The first observation that Freud makes is life is not a smooth sail. Life is difficult. Life is hard. Life is hard primarily because of nature. We have heard about so many natural calamities. The recent years that we have been witnessing one calamity over another. We also realize today this pandemic, that's also partly the nature's fury in some way. There is suddenly a virus that is provoked and we are all victims of that. So we also had in the past tsunami, floods, landslides, earthquakes, all kinds of calamities. So nature makes our life very hard. Now there is an irony about it. The irony is that it is the same nature that nourishes us. It is from the nature we get all that we need to sustain our lives. We get our food, we get our clothing, we can make shelter based on what nature provides us. Nature nourishes us. But again, without any warning, it just destroys us. It becomes furious. So there is an ambivalent reality about nature. Ambivalent means there is, kind of a confused aspect because it involves both. It basically means it involves both contradictory aspects of life. So nature is ambivalent in that sense because it is the same nature which nourishes us also destroys us. So this is the first observation that Freud makes by looking around us. This is very simple for us to understand. There is nothing very complex, and perhaps all of us would agree with this understanding that nature nourishes us, and at the same time it sometimes becomes very furious so as to destroy us. We have heard about so many people whose livelihoods are affected by this fury of nature. The second observation that Freud makes is we never know our future. Now that is quite interesting, and I always used to think whether Freud, being a Jew, has also been influenced by a certain Jewish worldview. I mean, this is typically a Jewish worldview that you will never know the future. There's nothing certain about the future. Future is therefore capricious. Capricious means it is not predictable, it is not knowable, we cannot be certain about what is in store. Now when future is not predictable, not knowable, there is a certain anxiety about future. That explains why people are very anxious about what is happening, what will happen to us tomorrow, day after. We have got a beautiful statement in the Gospels. Look at the birds of the sky, the lilies of the field. They are not worried what to eat, what to dress, and so on. They hardly have any anxiety. Now, part of the anxiety about future is precisely because the future is something that I can never know in advance. Now, this captures, as I told you, a typical Jewish worldview. Freud has not explicitly said about it. Freud is a Jew by birth, but he's a declared atheist. He was not a follower of God or religion. But the worldview probably has influenced him. Normally we think of in the traditional, our own understanding of the time, we think of the past is something that is behind us. We have left that behind, and future is where we stand now. And future is something that is right in front of us, towards which we are moving. This is a typical linear Western understanding of time. But the Jews had a very different understanding of time. The past is that which lies in front of you, which you can see. Of course, the present is where you are. The future lies behind you, because you cannot see the future. Now we can understand the analogy. The Son of Man comes like a thief in an unpredictable time, which you would never know. It's about the future, something that you have never known. So that kind of unpredictability of future. Therefore, it leaves certain uncertainty. Obviously, with uncertainty, there is some anxiety that comes. This is the second observation that Freud makes about our life in general. The third observation is our insecurity is heightened by the civilization. Now, what does that mean? It is heightened by the civilization. Before we are civilized, people hardly had any hierarchical structure. There was no such division in terms of class. People were there just like animals in many ways. Whatever they get, they could eat. Otherwise, they were hunting. They were doing whatever there was no such thing as somebody has occupied a higher status than others, either in terms of economy or social position, nothing of that. Therefore, civilization necessarily brings with it a certain class society. So it creates a distinction between the powerful, the significant, who have the power, the security, but at the same time, it also makes the powerless, the insignificant, to long for the power and security which they don't have. Now that explains a lot of struggle that we experience in contemporary world. It's because of civilization. So the powerful and those who are holding positions in the society, they feel insecure because they are worried that they would lose their power and position, pretty much like our own communities, isn't it? Whereas the powerless and the insignificant are longing for power and security. So therefore there is a certain insecurity in them as well. So insecurity is in every human being because of this civilization. So these are the three observations Freud makes. The first observation is nature makes our life hard even though it nourishes us. The second observation is future is uncertain, it is capricious. The third, civilization creates insecurity in all of us, in the powerful as well as in the powerless. These are the three observations that he makes in the first place. Then Freud says what we experience as adults in our life, we can find a parallel experience in our childhood. Just like that nature nourishes us but also threatens us, which makes us feel helpless, the child feels helpless. And the child has a need to be dependent on others. In front of nature, we are helpless. But at the same time, that very helplessness also makes us somehow to be dependent on that nature. That explains why the primitive man began worshipping the objects of nature, the sun, the plant, the animal, whatever it is, part of the nature, the star, the moon. These are all part of object of worship. Each one is given a kind of considered a god, the sun god, the moon god, the rain god, whatever god we may think of. So you see, the child feels helpless and has the need to be dependent on others, and it derives the sense of security by depending on its own father, biological father, obviously. The child somehow thinks his or her biological father is an all-powerful person. You might have noticed if two children are fighting, if one child is beaten up by the other, the child will say, I will complain about you to my father, as if his father can do something about it. In fact, he probably cannot. But that's not what is the mind of the child. The child thinks my father will defend me. Somehow the biological father is all powerful. So under the protection of this all powerful biological father, the child feels secure. But like nature, the father nurtures the child, but also the father threatens the child. The father is also the one who kind of frightens you, who thinks that, who makes you obey. So there is also a certain fear. There is a certain sense of security that we have in nature because it nourishes, but also there is a kind of fear about nature because it destroys us. This is exactly a parallel experience that we have in childhood with our relationship to the father. Because the father gives me security, in that sense he is somebody who is nurturing me. But at the same time that I feel threatened by him. So what happens is, for a child there is a mixed feeling or an ambivalent feeling towards his or her father. The ambivalent feeling is explained very well in the context of the two experiences the child has: the father who provides security, the nurturing father, but at the same time the threatening father who can punish me if I do something wrong. My father can sometimes beat me up. So there is a sense of fear. Therefore the child loves and hates the father. So there is both these dimensions at once. Well, Freud thinks all of us have undergone this process in our childhood. We have got love towards our father, but at the same time hate towards the father. Now, I am not a very expert psychologist, but I know one thing for sure. If somebody hates you so much, in the first place, that person has loved you so much. That is the trouble, you see. There is definitely behind this hate, there is this kind of love. But sometimes it is a madness of love. It's kind of extreme form, which is annoying. It can be very annoying and disturbing and disrupting. But sometimes people do that. So child loves and hates the father at once. So the child has the unconscious feeling of being alienated from his father because somehow he feels that his father would kill him. Just like we have the fear about nature, the nature can destroy me. The child has this feeling, this fear, which is not conscious. Now that is very important. For Freud, this whole things happen in the level of unconscious. You are not aware of it. You don't know about it. Somehow deep down you have this fear about the father who would kill me. But the child cannot do anything about it because the child is not as powerful as the father. And the child cannot kill the father. So what does the child do? The child cannot express this, and therefore the child represses this feeling. this feeling of fear. Now, this is exactly what as an adult we also really, according to Freud. I'll come back to that in a moment. The child's illusion of an all-powerful father does not, cannot be lived for a long time. It is short-lived. Now, as a child grows up, the child knows his father too is vulnerable. His father too is equally helpless as anybody else. Therefore, as you grow up, you cannot seek security in your biological father, because your biological father himself is insecure. So, as an adult, you want to seek the same security as you sought during your childhood. So, the way in which you try to cope with your insecurity as an adult is by reenacting the childish response. Now, how do you reenact this childish response? Because you cannot find security in your biological father. Very simple. We imagine an all-powerful father. You may call him by any name. Normally he is called God, who substitutes the child's biological father. What the child has been seeking in the biological father, now the child cannot get it, the sense of security. But remember, the child also has a fear about the father, because there is a fear that the father would punish me, even he would kill me, and so on and so forth. Now the child reenacts the same kind of behavior, the adult reenacts the same kind of behavior as a child, but this time by imagining an all-powerful heavenly father who substitutes the biological father. That explains why there is always this kind of seeking solace from God, but at the same time fearing God. Exactly what a child would do to the biological father. Seeking security in the presence of the father, but at the same time fearing him. We have the same kind of attitude when it comes to our religious experience, in our imagination of an all-powerful father. So religion is therefore, according to Freud, an infantile wish fulfillment. Infantile wish fulfillment. It is not something that exists really. It is only your wish fulfillment. But this wish fulfillment is also very infantile, because the attitude you have is that of a child, not of an adult. That is why Freud calls this, or calls religion, as infantile wish fulfillment. Thus, the believer loves the Father, Heavenly Father in this case, the God, but also hates the Heavenly Father. God becomes the provider and protector, the teacher, the guide, yes, but also God somehow frightens me. There is also a fear that he instills in me. So again, the believer's attitude to God is ambivalent, just like the child's attitude to his or her father is ambivalent. So the believer loves and hates the Heavenly Father at the same time. Hence, religion is a form of the need, of the helplessness of man. We find helpless. Now, you remember there are various reasons why we are helpless, according to Freud. At least 3 reasons we said right at the beginning. The nature is hard, the future is capricious, and there is heightened insecurity because of civilization. Now, on all this scenario, we find ourselves helplessness. So, religion is a form of the need of the helplessness of man. How? Because it helps man to banish the terror of nature. Somehow, we are able to see, well, God will take care of that. So when there is a tsunami, what do? You just go, close your doors, go to the chapel and pray. Because God will now banish the terror of nature. Religion also helps us to reconcile with our death. In different ways, different religion would do. In Christianity, for example, after all, finally we don't die. We really don't die. So we say, well, I'm only going to be born again in a different way, or perhaps in a better way, the heavenly way. So religion also compensates for the privations of cultural life. What I cannot get in my cultural life, that kind of insecurity that I realize I have, and therefore I cannot get many of those things, religion can provide me. When I feel I am insecure in my everyday life, all that matters is go and then be part of a prayer group, sing and praise, and you feel good about it. There is a compensation that is involved there. Religion does all this by projecting someone as God, an all-powerful Father. At the same time, the human beings don't want to be dependent on somebody fully. So therefore, there should be also a certain place for resentment and anger that often is exhibited in our religion, in our religious ways of doing things. The infantile religion, the religion which is very infantile of course for him, has strong resemblance therefore to anxiety disorder, what he calls the obsessive neurosis of humankind. Now that is a psychological term, obsessive neurosis. Now you might have heard of that anxiety disorder that obviously people say that is a kind of sickness. So exactly that kind of sickness is lived in religion. It creates a certain anxiety disorder in you. There is a certain obsessive neurosis, a compulsive behavior. So how does it work, this obsessive neurosis in religion? Religious thinking is not a free use of imagination, it is a compulsive thinking. In other words, in your religious beliefs, you don't have something spontaneous, something that you make use of creative imagination, something that is compulsive. It has to be like this. The belief has to be somehow like a particular way. So there is a compulsive attitude towards the beliefs. But also the religious rituals, the religious ceremonies, they are also neurotic. They are neurotic ceremonies. Why they are neurotic ceremonies? I have used the word already in obsessive neurosis, but I will type down neurotic ceremonies. In order to understand what Freud means by ceremonies, sorry, there is a spelling mistake there, ceremonies. In order to understand what neurotic ceremonies are, we have to first understand what is neurosis. Neurosis is basically certain actions you do compulsively, and without those actions you feel anxious. If that action is not done, you are very anxious about it, and you repeatedly do those actions, otherwise you somehow become anxious. I know one great man, who is so anxious about getting germs, affected by germs. I don't know whether he was pretty old at that time. I don't know whether he is still alive or not. If he is alive now, he must have been even more anxious. He will keep washing his hand anytime he touches anything. And he will always carry a paper tissue. That is a compulsive action. He has to keep washing. Without that, he will feel anxious. I know there are other people, when they close the door, they will, after locking their house door, they will come down. Then suddenly they will feel whether I have locked. They have to go back and check. 2 to 3 times they would go repeatedly and check. Without that, they feel anxious. These are compulsive actions. Religious ceremonies are exactly similar to these compulsive actions, without which you feel very anxious. Sometimes when some people come and tell me, share with me, I didn't do this particular prayer or I didn't do that, I feel anxious about it. The question I ask them is, are you becoming a neurotic? People do get anxious. I wanted to, 9 continuous weeks I wanted to go there, but 1 week I couldn't go. And then they will go on, feel this kind of certain amount of, anxiety about it, even to the extent of having some guilt. So religious ceremonies show remarkable similarity to these neurotic ceremonies. These obsessive actions are because we think, or we have an illusion, that we can have control over the internal and external world. If I go 9 weeks continuously to a particular shrine as part of my whatever the novena thing, I can control whatever I want to control. That is what exactly neurotics think. They think by doing certain things in a repeated way, they can control something. So the ceremony starts as an action for defense or insurance or as a protective measure. But then it becomes very compulsive over a period of time. And therefore that makes it neurotic ceremonies. Because of this neurotic ceremony, religion becomes obstacle to freedom and growth. Freud thinks it makes us passive, dependent, uncritical, and immature because we are told what we should do. And our natural freedom is curtailed from growth. So we don't enjoy real freedom and we really don't grow. So if you want to really grow, if you want to become mature, if you want to become adults, there is only one thing you need to do: give up religion. So this is how Freud looks at the individual religiosity. He looks at the origin of the individual religiosity in certain anxiety we have, in certain insecurity we have, and try to somehow create a mechanism by which these insecurities can be addressed. But in fact, what we end up doing is creating certain anxiety disorder, certain neurosis for us. So Freud is very critical about the individual religiosity. So in short, that is the idea, but I try to explain to you with all the background that Freud is trying to give us. The second theory that we are going to focus now is the phylogenetic theory of Freud. Now, phylogenetic theory refers not to the individual's religiosity, but the group's religiosity, the collective phenomenon. What is a collective group's religiosity? How does it originate? In an individual, it begins with certain insecurity, anxiety, and you want to somehow address that, but end up having anxiety disorder. You end up becoming neurotics. And how does it operate in the religious group, in a community, in a religious society? That study is called the phylogenetic theory. I have already typed the word, I will not retype again. The origin of religion in a particular group or a society for Freud can be understood as a collective phenomenon of guilt. Guilt is the starting point, but not of an individual guilt, but the collective phenomenon of guilt of the group. In order to substantiate this theory, Freud analyzes totemism. Now, you know totemism by now what it is. We have discussed about totemism in the context of Emile Durkheim, who thought totemism was the first religion. So Freud also analyzes totemism. And Freud realizes totem is often called father. A particular totem in a particular primitive society is considered like the father of the society. He's the ancestor. Father means not the biological father, but the great ancestor from whom all of them came. Now this will be very interesting. There are so many tribal stories, if you notice, They will say this animal or this bird is the totem for us because we all descended from this particular animal. I know there are some even northeastern tribals. There are many such tribal clans and so on. I may not be knowing all of them, but I interestingly found quite a lot of things. There is one tribe which is named after cloud, Pom in Nagaland. Now when I asked about what is Pom, Pom is a cloud, and our story is we all descended from the cloud, a special kind of cloud. So it's not only animal or plant, even cloud can be considered a totem. So that is the great ancestor. So totem is often equated with our great ancestor from whom we all descended. Of course, a particular community or a particular group. The second observation he makes about totemism is there are two kinds of taboos or prohibitions in totemism. Taboos is a common word, you must be aware of that. That which is considered to be forbidden is called taboo in a society. So there are two kinds of prohibitions or taboos in totemism. What are these two kinds of taboos? You should not kill and eat the totem. That is the first taboo. The second taboo is you cannot have any sexual relationship within the clan members. You cannot marry somebody from the same clan. You have to always marry outside the clan. These are the two taboos. You cannot kill and eat the totem because totem is normally an animal, sometimes a plant. You cannot kill it and eat it. The second one is you cannot have sexual relationship or marriage within the clan members. It should always be outside of the clan. Then Freud also makes an observation. Though these are prohibitions, once in a year, at ceremonial occasions, the totem is killed and ceremoniously eaten. Now, Freud is studying a primitive tribe, and based on that he is making these observations. So in spite of this particular kind of taboo that you should not kill and eat the totem, once in a year they deliberately do that on a ceremonious occasion. You kill the totem and eat it. But after that you have a period of mourning. What you have killed solemnly, then you begin to mourn for a period of time. And this period of time where you had the ceremonious occasions where you killed the totem, that is the time of festival where the sexual prohibition is also completely broken. There is no more sexual prohibition during that period of celebration, festivities. Now, after making observation by studying the totemism, Freud says in his clinical experience dealing with neurotic patients, Freud finds some of these things. Exactly what is found in the totemism. In totemism, the attitude of people towards the totem again is ambivalent. Just like in the individual religiosity, you have got the ambivalent attitude towards your biological father as a child, and later to the heavenly father, all-powerful father as an adult. So here also the attitude of the group towards totem is ambivalent. In other words, they have a positive attitude towards totem. They have also a negative attitude towards totem. So obviously this ambivalent feeling is parallel to the father complex in the child. So totem is a substitute father, not the biological father, the substitute father. So Freud says the first human society is a primitive horde which enforced rules of a powerful male. One powerful male enforced all the rules. You know what a horde is? A horde is normally the group of a particular group of animals. Obviously it refers to the horde of elephants. And if you know something about the elephants, normally they say in one horde of elephants, which many elephants will be there, but there will be only one powerful male. And that elephant alone kind of leads, and that elephant will not allow other male elephants to mate with the females. And normally the male elephants, when they are growing, they are chased away from the herd to find their own herd elsewhere. So which means the powerful male monopolized all women and forced other males to go and get women from other clans. Now you remember why you should marry women from other clan, or you cannot have sexual relationship within the clan, because there's only one powerful male who can monopolize. Everybody else, you have to be out. But what happened is, people cannot bear with the powerful male, in the primitive society, human society. So they obviously were doing something wrong behind the back of the powerful male. So when you do something wrong, what do? The powerful male, the alpha male, expels everybody else who is doing wrong. Now this is very human. When many people are expelled, what do? They make a plot against the one who expelled them. So the expelled males, they join hands and kill the powerful father. This is the primal patricide. Patricide means the killing of the father. Primal patricide, the first killing of the father. Now this primal patricide is precisely what is celebrated in the totem feast. You remember? In the totem feast, you kill the totem and eat it, which of course is followed by a period of mourning. So after killing, the anger is satisfied, but at the same time, the sense of guilt steps in. So that is why the period of mourning. So they want to make atonement. So as part of the atonement, they make a symbolic father. So the totem represents the primal father, the powerful male. So they make it a symbolic father and say, we will not kill you anymore, and we will renounce all crime. That means we will not have any relationship with the clan women. That is why these two taboos are found in totem society, that we do not kill the totem and eat it, and do not have sexual relationship within the clan. So the feast of the totem evolved from killing of the father, or the patricide, and it is expressed through symbolically celebrated totem's feast. See, the original sin is that at some time, somewhere, something has gone wrong in history. According to Freud, the son was to be killed as the atonement of the sin of the killing of the father. Now Freud is specifically referring to the Christian belief. So all religion somehow tries to bring about something. Now the killing of the father happens, therefore the son has to be killed as the atonement of the sin. So that is how Christianity deals with coping this guilt. Now there are many things that we can say of its relevance to different kinds of religions. I will take up some of these things during the discussion, some of the parallelism that we can find in actual religions today. Now we shall take up some of the critical comments. From the negative point of view, many scholars think Freud's story of the primitive horde, the original human society was a primitive horde, there was only one alpha male. It has no historical evidence, nor has any scientific basis. It seems to be an imaginative reconstruction of history by Freud. It remains a hypothesis, it is not tested and verified. So based on something that is merely an imaginative reconstruction, we cannot make a serious argument, which Freud ends up making. The second aspect of the negative criticism that we can make against Freud is about his ontogenetic theory. There are many objections that we can have towards this ontogenetic theory. True, there is certain infantilism that is plausible, But this theory cannot be taken all seriously. Because in the first place, when you speak about this ambivalent relationship between the father and the child, the love-hate relationship, Freud also relates it to the matter of a certain sexual repression. And many are very uncomfortable, and many modern studies have raised serious objections to this kind of study, that reducing everything to the sex drive of human person is inherently problematic. The third negative criticism that we can make against Freud is the idea of the obsessive neurosis of humankind. Now, what does Freud do? He is a clinical psychologist. He studies with people who have the anxiety disorder. They are mentally ill. And based on the study that he has made on such people, he is claiming that he has empirical evidence to show that there is a general obsessive neurosis of humankind which is manifest in religion. That seems to be a biased approach. If you want to have a real empirical study, you cannot study one group of people who already have this anxiety disorder, the mentally ill people. You should also study the other kind of people who don't have the anxiety disorder, who didn't need any therapy for that matter. So Freud seems to be biased in his approach, however inspirational it may be. He was against religion, so his theories need not be accepted as such. But at the same time, we cannot easily dismiss of his ideas. We need to look into his analysis and see to what extent we can take inspiration from it. So one thing is easily dismiss of something. True, we have to be aware of the fact that he is biased against religion, he was against religion, and therefore easily he could come up with theories that could paint religion in not so much in a good light. But that doesn't mean that we can easily dismiss of his claims. There are certain things that we can still take inspiration from. So therefore, positively, he has highlighted the aspect of religion that it is an emotional phenomenon. So religion, normally people think of it as a very rational discourse and so on, particularly after enlightenment. So that's why the whole emphasis on reason and faith are two wings and so on. Fine, but it also has this emotional phenomenon. So Freud has at least highlighted that, and that is something important that we cannot forget that. So it's very similar to what Durkheim has been saying about religion as well. There is the whole question of effervescence that is enacted when you have rituals, the exuberance and joy and the sense of belonging. All these are part of our emotional dimension. But at the same time, this particular approach would point to us that because it is an emotional phenomenon, it is a non-scientific solution for problems, and therefore it is also an emotional mistake. Another positive contribution of Freud is religion is unconscious symbol. You remember, most of things happen unconsciously. The child represses the anger towards the father unconsciously, the fear that it has about the father unconsciously. So religion also is an unconscious symbol. So the religious symbols have unconscious meaning. Some of these things, we will come back to that during the time of discussion. Now, whether you discuss online or you don't, but these are some of the questions I want you to reflect, either personally or collectively. These are the questions that Freud raises to us. I got 3 questions here, so you may like to reflect about it personally. Think about it, not for marks, not for assignment. The purpose of this whole course is to make you think a little bit critically about where we stand with regard to religion. How do I look at religion? How do I live my religion? So we can easily be very, very childish, infantile. We could be exactly like what Freud says. We could have an infantile wish fulfillment, all those kind of things. But ask yourself, where do we stand? The first question is, what is the relationship between religion and mental health? So Freud says religion institutionalizes immaturity. It doesn't allow you to grow into maturity because it curtails your freedom for growth. It keeps you childish all the time. So some studies have shown that religion is not helpful for mental health. Now there is a famous study of Peter Lords. I'll type his name. It's an empirical study. Very interesting study. Some of these studies can be always very helpful for us to be critical about ourselves. It is very important that we are critical about us. This study is about the clergy. So, people have expressed that the clergy have worse mental health than the laity, the ordinary people. So, is Freud somehow right that religion institutionalizes immaturity? It prevents us from grow as adults. And probably the clergy are the worst victims. They suffer from certain mental health, certain neurosis, certain compulsive behavior. That is the first question. Think about it. You can answer me later. Maybe I will give an assignment towards the end about any of the questions I have asked you to reflect. The second question that Freud raises is from the perspective of the ambiguity that exists in religion. This is something very interesting. I mean, none of us need explanation about it. All religions speak of love, mercy. I mean, who doesn't preach about love and mercy? I'm sick and tired of listening to all homilies. I'm sure you too are. But religions have systematically and rationally organized violence and cruelty both to its own members as well as members who are the outgroups, who are not part of them, who are not members of their particular religion. I mean, this is history. Historical record shows us religions, all religions, there is no religion which is an exception, including our beloved Christianity, have systematically and rationally organized violence and cruelty. So does this point to something of what Freud says to be true? There is a certain neurotic, compulsive neurosis, neurotic disorder. Now it's very interesting, Freud draws our attention to the ambivalence of the believer. You remember the love God and hates God. So hatred towards God gets repressed and therefore gets manifest in the violence. Violence oftentimes justified in terms of punishment, inflicted both on the in-group members and on the out-group members. We have huge records, historical records about it. So the cruelty of religion is something that is wrong in religion. We all know that. So this analysis of violence needs deeper attention. In other words, is violence intrinsically related to religion because we tend to repress certain things? And religion institutionally does it. And because it institutionally enables us to repress certain things, it also finds institutional expression of justifying violence in certain forms towards certain people. During the Inquisition, we know that. During the Crusades, we know that. We can give many examples. So the question, therefore, we need to think about is, do religions systematically and rationally organize violence? Or is violence inherently part of religion? From what Freud says, there is something that we need to think about. The third aspect is, what is the relationship between guilt and religion? You remember the collective an origin of religion, or the origin of the group's religiosity, is the common phenomenon of guilt. So the question is, does religion serve as a guilt generating and guilt processing agency? You create a sense of guilt, and then you try to somehow resolve the guilt, process it. So it seems to be kind of strange phenomenon in religion. So it somehow looks like, doctors who take care of your illness, but also they somehow give you other kind of illness, because if they don't have the illness, then they don't have job. Somehow do priests do that? They try to process guilt, but also they keep generating it so that they can process it. So you have to preach indefinitely about how bad you are, how guilty you should feel, and so on and so forth, so they can have their life going with absolving you and so on and so forth. So what is the relationship between guilt and religion? These are the three challenging questions that I place before you. Think about it. Don't take it very light. I don't think we can dismiss of Freud so easily. Some of what he says seems to be quite striking, at least the way we live out our religion. Religion in itself, okay, that is another thing. At least the way in which many of us live religion as very similar approach to what Freud calls obsessive neurosis. So with this, I conclude the lecture on Freud. We shall now take up some questions for discussion. Thank you.